guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're gonna talk about specimen orchids, what they are, how to obtain them or where to find them, and how much it takes for an orchid to become a specimen. And this is a topic that I'm kind of really interested in and focused on right now, both buying them, but also letting my orchids reach a specimen size by simply not dividing them like I was about 4 years ago. Alrighty, so let's start with explaining what a specimen orchid is. So a specimen orchid is actually a very old orchid. Generally, the older an orchid is, the more structures it will have. In the case of sympodial orchids, obviously it means more pseudobulbs with leaves. If you think that most orchids generally grow very slow, specimen orchids are usually more than 15 years old. As you've already guessed, a specimen orchid is big, but we're not referring here to the length of the leaves or the pseudobulbs or of the structures. A miniature orchid will forever be small, but it can be a specimen due to the number of its structures, depending on their growth pattern and rhythm, and also if they are prone to create multiple structures at one time. The time in which an orchid reaches specimen size can definitely vary. You can have orchids very prone to creating keikis or prone to having multiple directions of growth, so reaching a specimen size can be obtained a lot faster with those types of orchids. But of course, even in that case, it takes quite a lot of years. There are only a handful of orchid species that actually have fast growth in comparison to most other plants that we can grow in our homes. Typically, the orchids available at orchid nurseries or flower shops or garden centers are nowhere near specimen size, and this is because the nursery only keeps them until they are mature enough to bloom. So, as you might suspect, specimen orchids are pretty rare. It's rare that we can find them available for purchase online, while in flower shops or garden centers we almost never see very old orchids. Now, some orchids have the tendency to only create one structure, let's say one pseudobulb per year, while others can create 2 or even 3. Obviously, an orchid that does not produce more than one pseudobulb per year will not get to a specimen size anytime soon. But there are some orchids which, even if they create one pseudobulb per year, they are prone to having multiple directions of growth. The multiple directions are obtained from the willingness of the orchid to create more than one pseudobulb, or should I say new pseudobulb, per existing mature pseudobulb. So let's take for example this orchid. If from this pseudobulb only that one would have been created, then obviously it would have taken a lot longer for this orchid to reach a big size. Now, because I have 2 growths per pseudobulb, and this is not the only one that does this, the total time in which I have to wait until this orchid becomes a full bush, like the ones you saw earlier, will greatly be minimized. But why are we so attracted to specimen orchids? What are the benefits of having a big orchid? Well, in the case of sympodial orchids, the more growths you have on an orchid, the more blooms you'll have as well. Let's presume that one pseudobulb can create 4 flowers. Rather than having a yearly or seasonal display of 4 flowers, wouldn't it be better to have a display of 12 flowers if we had 3 available pseudobulbs that are new this year? So you can imagine that the more new structures an orchid has, the greater the bloom display. And if you ever Google specimen-sized orchids, you will see what I mean. The bloom display is gorgeous. We have an even distribution of flowers pretty much everywhere. And of course, the more flowers, the better. So more impressive flowering displays are the main reason why we kind of like specimen orchids. But there are a few more practical reasons as well, such as handling stress. If you have some experience with orchids, you know that an orchid which has, let's say, 3 pseudobulbs or 2 pseudobulbs will bounce back pretty slow. It will take a few years until the new structures reach the same size as the older ones. And this is because the new growth needs to withdraw energy from only 2 or 3 pseudobulbs. Now imagine an orchid with 20 pseudobulbs. New growths have 20 pseudobulbs to withdraw energy from. The more vigorous and mature structures an orchid has, the faster it can bounce back from stress sources. Also, if we imagine that an orchid took 20 years, let's say, to reach a certain size, we can also deduct that within that time it might have been affected by disease or by pests, and obviously it did manage to pull through. Now, because there is no real natural selection in cultivation, there is no way to tell which individual will be stronger and more hardy than the other. But obviously, big and old orchids have passed the test of time, so it is safe to assume that they are strong individuals. Although it might not be 100% the case, generally it tends to be. Also, within this time, they might have already developed some sort of resistance to whatever affected them. So obviously, the older and more established an orchid is, the more chances it has to have a strong immune system. So why are specimen orchids so hard to find? Well, obviously because they are very old. Usually sellers only hang on to their orchids until they are blooming size, and sometimes not even until then. We all know that orchids can be sold as young plants, not blooming size, and downright seedling in a flask. To put a price on a specimen orchid is kind of hard, partly because we don't have a reference price already set, partly because there is a big investment in such an orchid. Sometimes specimen orchids are just so expensive that they cannot be sold, and you can never know if those few people who can afford specimens will like the specimen you present. So most often than not, specimen orchids come from private growers, which decide to sell them due to lack of space or whatever other reasons. They can also come from nurseries every once in a blue moon, but usually those orchids were kept for display purposes. Many nurseries are open to the public and have visiting hours. They don't only sell online, but they can also be found on eBay or wherever people sell orchids. But if you imagine that you will buy a generic, let's say Cattleya orchid online and you will receive a big bush, chances are it's not gonna happen. At the same time, if you go to your local flower shop or garden centers, yet again, chances are you will not find a big specimen. But not to worry, you can obtain specimen orchids yourself as well. First thing you need to have is patience, a lot of patience. As I was saying, some orchids are more prone to multiple growths, and one of these days I will make a video with my orchids that produce the most growths. So if you're looking for a fast-growing orchid or one that gets a bush really fast, I think that will be an interesting video for you. But it also depends on the age of the orchid that you just purchased. When they are seedlings or very young, even the orchids that are prone to create multiple growths can be a little lazy. An orchid first needs to establish a basic storage system, and then it can go wild with the growths. So if we purchase a seedling orchid, all we need to do is care for it properly and, most importantly, never ever divide it unless it is absolutely necessary or growths have died or we have an infection or something of the sorts. If the orchid is healthy and is growing normally, do not divide it. And this is because the older growths, even after a few years, they can still decide to produce other new growths of their own. This again comes with time and with the orchid's ability to gather more energy. Now, there are a few things that you can do to encourage older growth to create new growth, and one of them is to actually snap the rhizome somewhere. I will not go into the details. I'll link you down below to my experiment video because I already did this with a Cattleya, but you have to know that not all orchids can be encouraged this way. It again has to do with the total strength of the orchid. If we have very, very old and tiny seedling growth, chances are they will not start new growth. Also, if we have a recovering orchid, a stressed orchid, yet again, chances are the older growths will not create new growths. Or if they do, they will take a lot of time to develop and it's a little bit risky. But if you wish to play it safe, really all you have to do is never divide the orchid. The second thing you need to do is never set it back. And this can be a little bit tricky because every time we repot orchids, we do risk damaging the root system and setting back the orchid. Now, the orchids will not die, but continuous setting back means slower and slower growth, which cannot lead to a lot of energy stored. Therefore, the orchid cannot grow very fast, cannot have multiple directions of growth, and all of those fun things that encourage a specimen faster. And here is where you have to be a little inventive or creative. My way of minimizing setting back the orchid due to repotting is by using inorganic medium, but this is not everybody's cup of tea. A good advice that you might already know is to repot orchids right when they start to create new roots. Not necessarily new growth, because some orchids don't create new roots when new growth starts. It needs to mature first. So I would disregard that. Try to focus on roots. When the orchid starts to produce tiny little roots, repotting it at that time minimizes the setback and the stress. Not completely avoids it, but it minimizes it. So if an orchid is healthy and doesn't have any urgency, such as pest in the medium or rotten roots, it's a good idea to follow this rule and repot it only when new roots grow. But please don't take this literally. If your orchid is in desperate need of repotting, don't wait up on it because you want a specimen. It doesn't work like that. If your orchid is stressed or is killed by whatever is in the medium or the pot or whatever, then you should repot it urgently, because even if you don't, it will still be set back if the medium is killing the roots. And the third thing you should do is provide nutrients. Nutrients pretty much make the difference in whatever plant you're growing. The less nutrients you provide to your orchid in regards to what it actually needs, the slower it will grow, the tinier the structures as well. If you provide adequate fertilizer combined with adequate temperature and adequate light, plus air movement and pretty much common sense hygiene, those things combined will make sure that the orchid will grow at its normal speed, or actually at the maximum speed growth that it can have. Like with everything, extremes are never good, so even if orchids do require nourishment and fertilizer, do not go overboard with that in the hopes that it will help the orchid grow faster. You only need to provide as much as the orchid requires. The smaller the orchid is, the less it will require generally, while as it grows and has more structures and a more massive root system, the more fertilizer it might require. So up until now we talked about sympodial orchids, because generally these are the orchids that show the most their age. Things like Phalaenopsis orchids and Vanda orchids can reach specimen size as well, but in a different way. Their size will only be shown by leaves and also by keikis. The more a monopodial orchid lives, the more it is prone to create keikis, and in years those keikis will reach maturity and they will bloom. Generally, monopodial orchids, I at least feel, reach specimen size slower than sympodial orchids. So usually monopodial orchids create a limited number of keikis, which grow in time and which create keikis of their own, so pretty much it takes a lot of years, let's say for a Vanda orchid, to reach a massive growths. But it's not impossible. All you need to do is Google it and you'll see the wonders. But overall, it's not impossible to have a specimen monopodial orchid. Usually it means it has a lot of keikis or a pretty long axis. Seeing specimen monopodials is just slightly more rare than seeing sympodial specimens. But of course, nothing is perfect, nothing comes without drawbacks. Having a big orchid means it will require a lot of space. Depending on the type of growth, it can require space on a horizontal or even on a vertical, for orchids which tend to grow very tall. So in my opinion, that is the major downside with specimens. You need to have space for them. And sometimes you might not prefer to have one big orchid on your shelf rather than, let's say, 10 smaller ones. Also, they do require more resources. They require a bigger pot, more medium if they're potted, more water, more fertilizer, and so on. So in the end, it's really up to you to decide if they're worth it, if the bloom display is just so fantastic that you would dedicate an entire shelf for 1 or 2 specimen orchids. Now, even though the vast majority of orchids we can grow can reach to a specimen size, some of them cannot due to the way they grow, such as Pleone orchids. If we consider that old bulbs simply die off and new bulbs are created, then having a connected structure, one single plant of a massive size, is pretty impossible. But we can have a lot of structures separated coming from one individual. So I guess you can create a sort of specimen due to the sheer number of pseudobulbs, but one connected orchid, big orchid, cannot be achieved with orchids such as Pleone orchids. Good thing is there aren't many orchids that we can grow with this type of growth, so pretty much the vast majority of orchids you have, even the monopodials, can be grown into a specimen size if you have patience. So alrighty guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Hope you found it useful and interesting. If you've enjoyed this video, give it a like. If you hated it, give it a dislike. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchids and plants videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye! Now, honestly, I don't really have super impressive specimens except for the Maxillaria tenuifolia that I received this year from Roger, and maybe this Phragmipedium, the Bessay hybrid that I purchased this year. It has 20-something growths. So when those growths will be mature, we can talk more about a superb specimen. Right now, I think he's still on the verge. And most of the big orchids that I have, big or bushy orchids that I have, are on the verge of becoming specimens. They're not yet jaw-dropping big. But I think I'm getting there. They really have a great appeal to them. And wait till they bloom. Oh my.